Even with a healthy amount of missed potential, due to the NHL mostly getting in its own way when it comes to marketing over the last couple of decades, it is still a multi-billion-dollar business today, where half of the teams or thereabouts are worth $1 billion themselves, and even the ones that aren't valued that way could very well sell for that much if they were on the market. In fact, one of the teams valued the lowest in the Ottawa Senators looks like it could do just that as I record this video. But, well, today it may be a very healthy business, even if some of its competition has outpaced it over the recent years. It wasn't always that way. By the time the late 70s rolled around, although all the expanding the NHL had done over the last decade had certainly helped, it still wasn't the healthiest organization ever. And the merger between the WHA and the NHL in 1979 was certainly a necessity for the long-term health of the league, not only because it got rid of the competing professional league that was taking players and attention away from the NHL, but also because it helped expand it to 4 more cities, including 3 Canadian ones, which is a ratio that Canadian fans can only dream of today. However, still easily the best thing to come out of the merger for the NHL was the addition of a teenager by the name of Wayne Gretzky. Now, most of you watching this have probably already heard the name Wayne Gretzky before, even if it's literally the only thing you know about hockey is that he played it. And while this entire video could easily be about his incredible career, and there are plenty of those videos out there if you're interested, for the sake of time, let's just say that over the course of his 20-year NHL career, he completely rewrote the record books. Goals, assists, points, MVPs, whether it's career or single season, he pretty much has the record for everything that isn't having to do with playing goaltender. And most of those records still stand to this day. In fact, when it comes to the single season records, not only does he hold the record for most of those, but also frequently has second, third, fourth, and so on locked up as well. As an example, his 87 goal season in 83-84 is second only to the 92 goals that he scored in the 81-82 season at the age of 21. He also holds 9 of the top 11 point seasons, including the top 4, and 11 of the top 12 assist seasons ever in the NHL, including all of the top 7. Entering the NHL at the age of 19 with Edmonton Oilers via that merger with the WHA that we already mentioned, Gretzky certainly didn't waste any time making his presence known across the league, as in his very first year in it, he led the league in both assists and points, and then continued to do that for the foreseeable future as he would go on to lead the league in assists in his first 12 seasons in the NHL, and lead the league in points in 10 of those years, including his first 8. As well as leading the league in goals in 5 of those. This complete and total domination of the NHL by Gretzky was not even necessarily something that a lot of people had seen coming. Sure, there were plenty of signs that he was capable of it after what he had done throughout his entire childhood and junior career, and heck, even the one season he spent in the WHA, he was pretty fantastic in at the age of 18 before the merger. But even during that season, after just 8 games, he was traded by the Indianapolis Racers to the Edmonton Oilers as the Racers were folding for financial reasons. But before the Oilers had their chance to get Gretzky, it was actually the Winnipeg Jets, not the current Jets, but the first version, that had the first crack at it, and ultimately decided that Gretzky was just too small to really have much of a lengthy or impactful pro hockey career. Sure, he had been able to do it in lower leagues where hitting wasn't as much of a thing, but in the physical game that was the pro game at the time and much bigger than it is today on average, he just wasn't going to be able to cut it. Now, in hindsight, that has proven to be possibly the worst decision ever made in the history of pro sports, but it was still a sentiment, even after what he did the rest of that season in the WHA, that prevailed into his early NHL career. Heck, even after what he did in his first season, there was still feelings that, sure, he was great now, but just wait until he started to get beat up by some of the bigger, more physical players across the league. But thankfully, as we all know by now, that never ended up happening, and even in spite of the fact that he was never necessarily one of the fastest players like McDavid is today, or had the best shot like Ovechkin had for at least a large part of his career, if not still has, and certainly was not the biggest player in the league. In fact, he was definitely on the smaller end, at least at the time, even if by today's standards he'd actually be a more average-sized player. He still went on to have easily the greatest career in the history of the sport, and potentially even professional sports as a whole. Largely due to the fact that he was able to see and read the game like no one ever had before him, and the likes of which we still haven't seen since. Just had this almost sixth sense for the game that gave him the ability to almost know where everyone else was going to be before they did, which definitely shows up when you look at those assist numbers in particular. Even with Gretzky though, and in spite of the fact that the NHL, which now consisted of 21 teams, was still dominated by dynasties, with 3 teams winning 14 of 15 cups between 1976 and 1990, the Oilers would still have to wait their turn. As in Montreal, the Habs would win each of the 4 cups in the 4 years leading up to the merger, with a roster that consisted of up to 10 Hall of Famers on it at once, and 3 guys named Pierre, though it was headlined by Guy Lafleur, Jacques Lemaire, and Ken Dryden. Then as the merger brought 4 new teams into the league, a new team would find their way onto the cup for the first time. Or at least the first year anyway, as they would win 4 straight of their own, that being the New York Islanders from 1980 to 1983, with a team that only ever had 5 Hall of Famers on it at once, including guys like Mike Bossy, Brian Trottier, and Dennis Potvin, and of course, 2 Bobs. Eventually though, the Oilers' time would come. As well, Gretzky was making 200-point, 70-plus goal seasons look routine, something that still only he has done. His teammates in Paul Coffey, Yari Curry, and Mark Messier were having great, though more reasonable production-wise seasons of their own. Meanwhile, Grant Fuhr was providing an always important solid backstop in net for the Oilers, as they would go on to win 5 of the next 7 Stanley Cups. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait a minute, Gretzky only ever won 4 Stanley Cups, and now you're telling me the Oilers won 5? Yes, and that's because Gretzky wasn't there for the 5th one. On August 9th of 1988, the Oilers traded the greatest player of all time, along with Mike Krushelnytsky, Marty McSorley, who was basically Gretzky's on-ice bodyguard, for 3 first-round picks, $15 million, Jimmy Carson, and Martin Jelena. Which, I mean, look, trading the best hockey player to ever lace up a pair of skates in his prime is one thing in its own right, regardless of what the return is, but it would be extra insane if you then went and, let's say, traded him to a division rival. Yeah, and that's exactly what ended up happening, as the Oilers would send Gretzky to LA to play with the Kings, even in spite of a lot of pushback within the organization, including the GM, and even some in the Canadian government who wanted to try to keep Gretzky in Canada as some kind of national treasure. In the end, though, none of it ended up working, and the trade went through to send Gretzky to LA to play with the division rival. Of course, it is worth mentioning that the main reason that this trade happened in the first place, and why ownership pressed it through in spite of the fight back from their management of the team as well as those within government, is because that $15 million that the Kings were able to provide that some other teams that tried to get involved couldn't, that ended up pushing it over the top. Now, in hindsight, outside of the Kings knocking out the Oilers in the first round of the playoffs that next year, the trade actually didn't turn out all that bad for the Oilers, who would go on to win another title the following season, and the Kings would never end up managing to lift the cup with Gretzky on the team. But still, there's always going to be the questions of what the Oilers could have done had Gretzky never left. As far as the league and sport as a whole was concerned, though, the trade could hardly have gone any better, moving the greatest player of all time from a city way up north in Canada to the largest non-Original Six market in the US, hugely helped grow the sport and popularize it in the States like little else had to that point or has since. Even with everything that Gretzky was able to accomplish in his career, as with anything, there's always going to be the naysayers and people that try to downplay Gretzky's greatness by saying things like he only scored as many points as he did because the era he was in was one where, let's just say, points and goals were not hard to come by, which is true. The 80s and 90s were one of the highest scoring eras of hockey the NHL has ever seen, But at the same time, Gretzky was still putting up 70 to 80 more points than second place in the peak of his career, which I think should say enough about just how good he was, even for the era he was playing in. But almost regardless of what someone's reasoning is for trying to argue that Gretzky wasn't the greatest of all time, the consistent is often who they're arguing in the favor for. And that is another guy that played a lot of the same time period that Gretzky did, but on the other side of the continent. At least while Gretzky was in the West, before he went over to the East for the final few years to play with the Rangers, but anyway. Unlike Gretzky, Lemieux joined the NHL via the NHL draft as a first overall pick, which, unsurprisingly, meant that the team he was joining in the Pittsburgh Penguins was terrible, and had been for a couple of years. Now, eventually they would end up getting better a few years later, thanks in large part to Lemieux, who was scoring 100 points every season for the first 6 seasons of his career. But still, the team did finish second to last or last in their division for the first 4 years that he was there, and that made it 6 straight overall. Those continued struggles of the team, both on and off the ice, as they already were not doing great financially, did start to grow some concerns about the long-term viability of the Penguins in Pittsburgh, especially after even a 199-point season in 89-90 from Lemieux, which is the closest anyone not named Gretzky has come to 200, was not enough to get things going. But finally, the very next year in 90-91, which weirdly was the first year Lemieux would miss most of due to a back injury, his teammates picked up the slack in Jaromir Jagr, Mark Ritchie, and ex-Gretzky teammate Paul Coffey to get the team to the playoffs for just the second time in nearly a decade. Fortunately for them, Lemieux was back for that playoff run, and he came up huge over the course of what would be 23 games that he would score 44 points in route to winning it all. And then the very next year, a healthier Lemieux and the Penguins would do it again to make it back-to-back cup wins for the first 2 in the franchise's history. The Pens would make the playoffs in each of the next 9 seasons, but only win those 2 cups during Lemieux's 17-year playing career, which he spent all of in Pittsburgh. Fortunately, though, the 2 titles did come at the right time and may very well have saved the franchise, at least for the time being. And I say for the time being because even with a now very successful team on the ice, the franchise off the ice was still a horribly run financial mess that by 1998 owed $90 million to various people, including a lot of their players, one of whom was their largest creditor, that being, you guessed it, Mario Lemieux. And so, with the team heading into bankruptcy and once again in serious threat of moving or maybe even folding entirely, once again it was Lemieux to the rescue with an offer the likes of which we had not seen before and will never see again with how expensive teams have become, as he offered to buy controlling interest in the team with the money that they owed him. And sure enough, that's just what the freshly retired Lemieux did, making the Penguins his team. And of course, once again, though this time for sure, in the process, saving the Penguins. Once again, the mathematicians among us have probably figured out by now that while I did say Lemieux played 17 seasons in the NHL, there aren't 17 years between 1984 when he was drafted and 1997 when he first retired. And yes, sure enough, that is because 4 years after retiring and 2 years after buying the team, Lemieux decided that the thing his team really needed to get to the next level was him playing on it. And so he came out of retirement and played for at least part of 5 more seasons. Unfortunately, because of injuries, he wasn't able to play as much as I'm sure he would have liked to, but was still able to contribute more than his fair share. In fact, his first season back from retirement in 2000-2001, he led the league in points per game with a 76-point campaign in just 43 games. Even for as incredible as his return from 4 years of retirement was, though, still easily the most impressive part of his career, and maybe any career for that matter, was what he did much earlier, in fact, the year after the back-to-back Stanley Cups in the 1992-93 season. And it's not necessarily immediately obvious based on the stat line alone what's so incredible about this season. I mean, sure, the 160 points are good enough for the 13th best season all time, but even just for Lemieux, that was his 4th best season of his career. And yeah, he does have a pretty nice goal total, but he'd already scored more than that twice by this point as well. No, what makes this season stand out in particular, and puts it right up there with Gretzky's 92-goal season and his 215-point season, is how Lemieux got to those 160 points. 41 games into the Penguins and Lemieux's season, it was already clear to everybody that hockey history was unfolding out in front of them, as Lemieux, thanks in part to a 4-game longer season than the ones that Gretzky set his records in, was on pace to break Gretzky's record for points in a season with 218. And also come dangerously close to breaking the goals record as well. Unfortunately, we'll never know whether or not Lemieux would have broken either one or maybe both of Gretzky's records. This was at that point, on January 5th of 1993, that Lemieux announced that he had been diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, cancer, and was going to start treatment right away. Now, for any normal human being, even in a best-case scenario where he's able to get through treatment and beat it, this would certainly mean the end of the season, especially with it already half over. Now, as I'm sure you've probably picked up on by now, that would not end up being the case here. As well, Lemieux would end up beating cancer, completing treatment just under 2 months later. He would immediately return to the ice and playing for the Penguins, which is incredible in its own right, so I think it would be understandable if it took him a little while to get his legs back under him and wasn't quite the same player for the rest of this season, and probably give him at least an off-season to get back to his typical level of play, never mind what he had been doing up to the point in which he left. But no, instead he came back and over the last 19 games of the season, not only kept up what he had been doing when he left, but actually managed to play even better. In those 19 games, putting up 30 goals and 26 assists for 56 points, which is good for nearly 3 points per game and over a goal and a half per game, making it one of the hottest stretches anybody has ever had in the NHL. And again, if I haven't mentioned it, he did that after returning from beating cancer. In the end, in the 60 games he was able to play that season, he was still able to score a pretty nice amount of goals with 91 assists for those 160 points that we mentioned. And had he been able to continue that rate of scoring over the 24 games that he missed for a full 84, which isn't out of the realm of possibility considering he bookended those 24 games with scoring even better after he came back, he would have easily broken both of Gretzky's records with 224 points and 97 goals. As it is, it's maybe not fair to assume that he would have played a full 84 considering he never played a full season, and again, there are 4 extra games in that 92-93 season than when Gretzky set either of his records. So then just in an 80-game season, well, he would have been just 2 points shy of Gretzky's record with 213, and would have had the exact same number of goals with 92. Now, of course, the 80s and 90s weren't all about Gretzky and Lemieux. They certainly were a big part of it, but it was also a time of an expanding talent pool that the NHL was drawing from, as more and more players were starting to enter the league from Europe, which was definitely helped in part by the merger with the WHL because, while European players, and certainly ones that played notable roles on their teams, were somewhat rare in the NHL up until the merger, the WHL had a lot more of them, and many of those guys joined the NHL via that merger, which started to open that door up a little bit more. Probably most notably of which would be Jari Kurri, who we already talked about being a big part of the Oilers dynasty with Gretzky that won all those Stanley Cups and came over as a part of the merger with the Oilers. For a variety of geopolitical reasons that are beyond the scope of this video, though, it wasn't as easy as just coming to North America for all European players at the time. And in 1980, Czech-born Peter Stastny, along with his brother Anton, became the first to defect from his home nation with the help of the team he would go play for in the Nordiques. Then, nearly a decade later, the dam would really break when, although the Soviet Union had been allowing some guys to come over and play in North America, it wasn't until 5 others came over under less Soviet-accepted methods that the first real splash by Soviet players was made in the NHL. A story told well in full by the documentary The Russian Five, the Red Wings had gone 40 years without a Stanley Cup and were desperate to turn things around, and they knew there were good players in Russia if only they could get them over, eventually getting Sergei Fedorov to become the first, who was quickly followed by Vladimir Konstantinov, Slava Kozlov, Slava Fetisov, and Igor Larionov, the five of whom would frequently play together as a five-man unit on the ice for the Red Wings, and would eventually lead them to back-to-back Stanley Cups in 97 and 98. Even though, and this unfortunately probably doesn't come as much of a surprise, the sudden influx of Russian players wasn't necessarily welcomed by all hockey fans at the time. Not that any of them or the Red Wings particularly cared what others thought, and they certainly more than proved their abilities on the ice, and eventually more Russian players would start coming to the NHL. The talent pool wasn't the only thing expanding though, because while the 80s had been a fairly stable time league-wide for nearly a decade, 21 teams with hardly any movement other than the Rockies going from Colorado to New Jersey to become the Devils, and in 1980 the Flames going from Atlanta to Calgary where they stayed the Flames, the 90s were much the opposite. In 91, San Jose joined the league in maybe the strangest way a team ever has, via a deal with the North Star's new owner, and the league where they would be given half of the players from the North Stars roster and then participated in an expansion draft with the North Stars, who were still part of the league. And in case you're wondering, they named the team the Sharks as it was a runner-up in a public vote to the name the Blades, which ownership vetoed, feeling that it was too easy to mistake for a weapon. The next year, Ottawa finally rejoined the NHL, getting a new team and going with an old name in the Senators, along with Tampa Bay joining the league as the NHL wanted to focus on getting a little bit more presence in the southern US, that team being named after something that came to their owner during an evening thunderstorm in Florida: the Lightning. In the NHL Southern Conquest, though, one team in Florida clearly wouldn't be enough. So in 1993, the Panthers also joined the league alongside the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim, who got their name as a way for Disney to market their new movie franchise about a youth hockey team in Minnesota, also called the Mighty Ducks. I suppose then, somewhat ironically, that was also the last year that Minnesota would have their own team in the NHL, at least for a while anyway, as the still financially struggling North Stars, who hadn't gotten that much better in their expansion draft alongside the Sharks, decided to pack things up and move south to Dallas, dropping the name North for obvious reasons and becoming just the Stars. And while the furious expanding would stop with the Ducks and Panthers, at least for a few years anyway, teams moving did not, as three of the teams that had joined in the WHA merger, the three that didn't have Wayne Gretzky as a part of them, would all end up relocating within a 3-year span. At least part of the reason for that was that the 94-95 season was cut nearly in half, from 84 games to 48 thanks to the league's first ever lockout, as owners who were growing increasingly unhappy by how much money was coming out of their pockets due to growing player salaries really wanted a salary cap, and while ultimately they didn't quite end up getting it, they did make some large strides towards getting one, and as we know, would eventually get there. All that lost revenue, though, from missing nearly half a season, may very well have played a significant role, if not being the final nail in the coffin, for the relocations that would follow shortly. The first of which was the Nordiques moving in 95 to Colorado to become the Avalanche, who narrowly avoided an attempt by their owner to name the team the Extreme, but either way went on to win a Stanley Cup in their very first season in Colorado, thanks to a mid-season addition of goaltender Patrick Waugh, who demanded a trade from Montreal mid-season because of some drama going on there, and even aside from Waugh, it was already a pretty strong team, led by Joe Sakic and Peter Forsberg. In 96, though, the second domino would fall as the Jets would be moving down south to the desert, becoming the Coyotes, where they are definitely a much more stable franchise. And finally, in 1997, to make it 3 consecutive years of an ex-WHL team moving, the Whalers and their fantastic logo would also move south down the East Coast to Carolina, where they became the Hurricanes. At this point, with no other ex-WHL teams to relocate, other than, I suppose, the Oilers, though thanks in large part to Gretzky, they were much too stable of a franchise to do that to, it was time to start expanding again. So in 1998, the Nashville Predators would join the league. Then the following season in 99, Atlanta would get their second chance at the NHL with the Thrashers. And in 2000, the NHL would also go back to Minnesota finally with the Wild, and Columbus for the first time with the Blue Jackets, finally getting to 30 teams total. There is, however, one other pretty notable thing that happened back in the early 90s in 1993 that got a bit lost in that whole massive expanding and then moving around of teams and half-season lockout that caused the movement of more teams. That was the naming of the first commissioner of the NHL in Gary Bettman, who played a big role not only in that lockout that caused the movement of those teams, but also in the expanding and move south into the US to get a little bit more of a foothold down there. He's continued to have a big influence on the NHL ever since and all the way up until the present day. That, however, is a story for another time. So if you have enjoyed this one, thank you very much for joining. There will be a part 6 and probably even 7 and 8 beyond that, as many of you were kind enough to note your excitement for this part 5 to come out in part 4. It took a little bit over a year, but I wanted to make sure that I had the time to do it right, and it did take a while to put together, so hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, I'd love to hear about it down in the comments section. And if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below that help support the channel, as well as a link to a fancy new Patreon that we got set up if you really would like to help support the channel even more and have the means to do so. If not, totally understandable. Either way, until next time in part 6, or hopefully sooner, see you then. Stay safe out there. Be good to each other. God bless, and go whoever your team is. Hopefully Kraken, though.